comes to comic books, there are two giants that always come to mind: DC Comics and the Stan Lee-founded giant Marvel Comics. Arriving on the scene around the same time, it was DC that had the upper hand. DC Comics created some of the most legendary characters into the mainstream, such as Superman and Batman. Marvel, on the other hand, didn't have such a welcoming start, with its first characters including Namor the Submariner. But the company would finally get its name out into the mainstream in 1942 with the premiere of their character Captain America. It would be the Silver Age of comics in the 1950s and 1960s, where Stan Lee and other legendary names of the comic industry would start to think outside the box, creating some of their most popular and beloved characters. Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men were the big names that flooded into the market, creating some true competition with their giant rival DC. It was time for Marvel to jump into another market that DC had already conquered. Television, like the comic book industry, had DC out in front, starting with the early Batman serials of the 1940s and the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons of the 1950s. The 60s would see even more success with the premieres of the George Reeves Superman series and the Adam West Batman series. Marvel was obviously watching their competitor and noticed that one of the areas where DC was lacking was the kids market and Saturday morning cartoons. The Max Fleischer cartoons did have success with young audiences, but Marvel could tell that the fans wanted more. Marvel's first attempt was the 1966 show Marvel Superheroes. This show featured 30 minutes of various popular heroes including Captain America, Hulk, and Thor. The show lasted one season with a total of 66 episodes. The following year, Marvel would team up with the popular animation studio of Hanna-Barbera and premiere the animated series of Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four. It would be played alongside Hanna-Barbera's own creations including Space Ghost, Birdman, and the Herculoids. While the show would see some popularity after one season thanks to syndication, it would be upstaged by another Marvel Comics creation. Teaming up with a legend in the making, Ralph Bakshi, Stan Lee would create an animated series of Spider-Man. With the fun factor of a young superhero and an extremely catchy theme song, Spider-Man would have a successful 3-year run and many years of syndication. With a short run with Hanna-Barbera, the 1970s would surprise Marvel with a massive beatdown from DC, as the Super Friends would pretty much dominate the decade. But Marvel was already thinking bigger and better as they prepared to make the jump to live-action television. Once again, Marvel would see DC way ahead of the game. With the success of Superman and Batman in the 1950s and 60s, the 1970s would see 3 live-action DC shows. 1974's Shazam, with a successful 3-year run, and the 1975 Secret of Isis with another successful 3-year run. However, it would be Linda Carter as TV's Wonder Woman that would dominate network television from 1975 to 1979. Marvel would try to capture the magic once again by bringing their friendly neighborhood Spider-Man back to the small screen with a live-action TV series in 1977. Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, would be played by Nicholas Hammond, who played one of the 7 Von Trapp children in the 1967 classic The Sound of Music. For the time, with not much to work with in terms of visual effects, the show would receive a cult fan base and last for 2 strong seasons. Marvel would unfortunately see failure with some of their other live-action projects, with 2 failed pilots: Doctor Strange, starring Peter Hooton in 1978, and Captain America in 1979, starring Red Brown. Strangely enough, Captain America would receive an even worse sequel made for TV called Captain America 2: Death Too Soon. However, 1978 would bring one of Marvel's biggest television success stories to light. With the help of new cinematic technology and advances in computers, Marvel would create The Incredible Hulk, starring Bill Bixby as Dr. Bruce Banner and bodybuilder Lou Ferrigno as the Giant Green Hulk. This TV show would last until 1982, receiving tremendous praise amongst TV fans and create one of the most memorable scores for a television show. With a new decade still in its infancy, many changes were taking place in terms of entertainment. Seeing that DC once again was ahead of the game, it was time for Marvel to grab onto DC's coattails again and soar into the silver screen. 1978 would see the Man of Steel smash the box office records as Superman would become one of the highest-grossing films of the year. With the birth of the blockbuster film, movie makers wanted their films to be bigger and better. Many genres of film that were always looked at as trash were starting to make the most money. Science fiction films would be frontiered by Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and even one of the pioneering names, Star Trek, would hit the silver screen in 1979, but see tremendous success in 1981 with Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Disney would even break away from its traditional animation to show off its own darker side with 1979's The Black Hole, and even tackling horror with 1980's Watcher in the Woods. Horror and fantasy would dominate the 1980s, along with science fiction in the world of film. The 1980s would see the birth of the legendary slashers like Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. Jim Henson would use the power of puppetry and animatronics with films like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and computer animation would see its maximum potential at the time with films like Tron and Wargame. From 1984 to 1986, things would only get bigger and better for all of these genres, and in 1986, with the help of George Lucas, Marvel would premiere its first ever theatrical release. However, it was probably one of the most unknown and obscure characters that Marvel had ever conceived. Back in 1973, Marvel created Howard the Duck, a series of misadventures from an ill-tempered anthropomorphic duck trapped in a human-dominated Earth. Howard's adventures would generally use social satires, while a few were parodies of genre fiction with the metafictional awareness of the medium. No one would have ever thought at the time that this character would be the launching pad of Marvel's big screen run, but it happened on August 1st, 1986. Starring Back to the Future's Leia Thompson and Ferris Bueller's Day Off's Jeffrey Jones, Howard was from a planet of ducks and suddenly transported to Earth to be taken in by a headlining vocalist for an up-and-coming new wave rock band. Definitely a story that would fit the creative times of the 1980s. Film would also be scored by John Barry, the man who created the theme song for the James Bond franchise. With all of the potential this film had, it would be trashed at the box office. Critics would not show the film mercy as they went above and beyond to find every fault possible, from the poor use of animatronics to the basic plot of the film. Today you can find Howard the Duck with a 13% on Rotten Tomatoes. The film would receive 7 Raspberry Awards, including a Worst Supporting Actors Award for Tim Robbins, Worst Director, Worst Original Song, and Worst Visual Effects. Marvel would be cast out for a few years as the 1980s continued to roll on with movie-making magic. As the 1990s were approaching, Marvel would receive another kick in the head from its biggest competitor. The late 1980s were not kind to DC as well, with Superman 4: The Quest for Peace getting just as horribly panned by critics in 1987. The Man of Steel would take his final bow in Hollywood for a while. DC, however, would bounce back in 1989 thanks to an up-and-coming director known as Tim Burton with Batman. The comic book industry had gone down a darker path, shedding the family campiness that comics had seen for almost 2 decades. Thanks to Frank Miller's Batman story, The Dark Knight Returns, fans wanted to see that very Batman on the big screen. Michael Keaton would don a black cape and cowl alongside Jack Nicholson as the Joker. Batman, like Superman, would be praised and make a killing at the box office. Marvel felt it was time to now return to the big screen, and alongside Batman would bring one of their darker characters to the movie screens in The Punisher. Dolph Lundgren, who had already shattered the hearts of many science fiction fantasy faithfuls in 1986's Masters of the Universe, would deliver another bomb to the box office. More disappointment was not too far on the horizon. 1990 would see the release of a new film starring the first hero that made Marvel a household name. Captain America would feature the origin story of Steve Rogers, played by Matt Salinger, and he would help the Allies topple the Nazis in World War II and take down his own nemesis, the Red Skull, played by Scott Paullin. Captain America would be frozen only to wake up in the 1990s, where he would have to face his nemesis again and save the world. Marvel once again would emerge with a massive failure, as the film was almost universally panned by critics. Worse, this film would receive even more horrible feedback than Howard the Duck. The consensus was that this film lacked a script, budget, direction, and even a star capable of doing justice to the source material. This Captain America would be left under ice, and Marvel felt at this point perhaps the big screen was not the place for them. With the 1980s being some of the best years for the film industry, it was a shame to see such a pop culture giant with so much potential to be left in the dust. For now, Marvel would see the last of its time on the silver screen, and it would be a time for Marvel to rethink and regroup. With the horrible failures in the film industry, Marvel was still making an effort to make money through other areas of media outside of their comic books. Spider-Man was still a big name in television amongst the young viewers, with the 1983 hit animated series Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Marvel's biggest success in the 1980s would be their X-Men franchise. The X-Men were not your typical fantasy superhero story. Instead of getting their superpowers through gamma rays or cosmic rays, the X-Men were known as mutants. Human beings who were born with an X gene thanks to millions of years of human evolution. Unlike the heroes like the Fantastic Four or the Avengers, mutants would be seen as freaks and outcasts, much like what the United States saw in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement and segregation. There were also many characters that showed a great deal of diversity, as they were from many different countries, many different colors and creeds. Readers related to them in much stronger ways because of the deep stories and realism found in the comics. With the stories such as the Dark Phoenix Saga, Mutant Massacre, and Days of Future Past, Marvel saw tremendous success and at the time even saw them surpass DC as the most read ongoing comic series. In 1989, Marvel would start off small and air the pilot of their new X-Men animated series called Pride of the X-Men, which would feature the X-Men through the eyes of their mentor Professor Xaviers' newest student, Kitty Pryde. It would feature the most popular X-Men characters of the time, including the leaders Cyclops and Storm, the gentle metal giant Colossus, and the raging berserker Wolverine. The reaction from fans to the pilot were generally mixed, although praised for its high-quality animation. Purists were not too fond of the way certain characters were portrayed in the pilot. The show would not go past the pilot, but would ironically find success in the world of video games with a 6-player side-scrolling button masher later on. The game featured top-notch graphics, tons of familiar villains, and captured the success right before the video game industry would adopt one-on-one fighting games as the next big thing. That very same year would be all the more crucial for Marvel as DC would return with another hurdle for Marvel to jump. 1992 would give Marvel its biggest challenge to date. Along with a highly anticipated sequel of Tim Burton's Batman in Batman Returns, a young animator named Bruce Timm had brought Warner Brothers a brand new animated series featuring the Dark Knight. Making truly dramatic mini-movie-like episodes with an innovative, simple yet complicated animation style, Fox Kids would air Batman the Animated Series. This show would be the final nail in the coffin for Marvel, as this new show would be an overnight success, bagging tons of critical acclaim and awards. Marvel was not ready to throw in the towel. If they were officially going to go down, they were going to go down swinging, and Fox Kids would be the battleground. A few months after the premiere of Batman the Animated Series, Fox would air X-Men the Animated Series, a bit lighter than Batman in terms of atmosphere, but focused on deep stories, and a lot of fan-favorite stories loosely based on their well-known comic stories in the books. The show was both acclaimed and commercially successful. Along with Batman the Animated Series, success helped launch numerous comic book shows in the 1990s. The success of X-Men would not cause their biggest rival to back down, as they would come right back with 1995's Superman the Animated Series. But one show would not be enough to prepare for the barrage of series waiting for DC's newest project. 1994 would be Marvel's biggest year in animation, as they would release 3 animated series which would have a beautiful blend of cell and computer animation. Spider-Man the Animated Series would take X-Men's place as it concluded its 5-year run. and Spider-Man would last for an additional strong 5 seasons. Marvel would then release 2 animated series of Iron Man and Fantastic Four and would both see a successful 2-year run. What all these shows had in common was the creation of an entire animated universe, as heroes and villains from all over the Marvel spectrum would make appearances in these shows. Even Spider-Man and Captain America made small appearances in X-Men the animated series before that show would go off the air. 1996 would continue Marvel's animated run with Hulk the animated series, and concluding 1998 with Silver Surfer. Marvel's parent company would even receive new ownership in 1997 after filing for bankruptcy due to plummeting comic book sales. It would not stop Marvel from trying to get ahead, even with a third comic book company getting into the mix. Image Comics would release 3 animated series to television, this time conquering the vast cable network and network television. Image saw new success in cult classic status with MTV's The Max, CBS's Wildcats, and HBO's rated MA animated series of Spawn. The film industry would also be seeing new comic book films hitting the screen throughout the 1990s. Batman would see respect and dismay at the same time with Batman Forever and the laughable Batman and Robin. However, there was a plethora of unknown comic book-based films hitting the silver screen left and right, and while some would be flops, others would be successes thanks to improving special effects and big-name actors attached. Some of the big moneymakers included the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise, The Mask starring Jim Carrey, and Men in Black starring Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. Marvel was already hard at work with their live-action comeback, with experimental live-action made-for-TV movies, including Generation X and Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. starring David Hasselhoff. There was one film in the mix that did resonate with a cult audience, and it was the 1994 gothic horror comic film, The Crow. Along with an unseen accidental death from the headliner Brandon Lee and the darker pop culture trends, Marvel felt it was time to give it one last try on the silver screen. In 1998, New Line Cinema would team up with Marvel and screenwriter David Goyer for Marvel's first full-length film since 1990. Thanks to the grunge era of music and the most popular comic characters at the time being some of the darkest, Marvel decided to take their chance with their half-human, half-vampire, vampire hunter Blade. With esteemed director Stephen Norrington and a cast including popular action star Wesley Snipes, Blade would hit theaters that summer with an R rating. The film would be action-packed, driven by special effects, and a killer soundtrack. While the film got a mixed bag of reviews from critics, the fans had an overall good time at the theaters. Being one of Marvel's lesser-known heroes, the studio had more liberties while sticking to the main plot of the comics. Finally, Marvel would see a light at the end of a long dark tunnel with a positive review from top critic Roger Ebert. A review like this could not have come at a better time as the new millennium was about to begin. 1999 would see a revolutionary year for movie making with so many new styles of special effects, particularly the uses of bullet time in The Matrix and all-digital characters in Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. Marvel felt that with a new era of film fast approaching, it was time to go all in and give the film-going public something that they have been waiting for decades, a popular comic book film franchise. Seeing success in comics, video games, and now the small screen, if Marvel was going to be the big name in comic book films, X-Men would have to be the franchise to set everything in motion. An X-Men film had been in the works as early as 1984. Many film studios, directors, and famous names were attached and detached to this project for almost 2 decades. The project was already being talked about in many comic book magazines, with fans pouring in input of which characters that they would like to see and which actors would play them. A young director named Bryan Singer started being talked about after his major success with a small film called The Usual Suspects, which won actor Kevin Spacey his first Academy Award. While Singer wanted to take on the fourth installment of the Alien franchise, Fox Studios felt that he would do a much better job with X-Men. Even the casting was a challenge, as Singer eyed Russell Crowe to play the ever-popular Wolverine, but Crowe would say no, not without telling the studio about his friend, an unknown Australian actor named Hugh Jackman, who was looking to break out into the United States. With larger names being tossed around and a $75 million budget, the studio realized they would have to make a lot of sacrifices by eliminating characters that would cost too much for makeup and special effects, and with a cast coming together, they would turn to Hugh Jackman at the end to give him his chance to shine. Along with a cast of well-established actors including Star Trek's Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Anna Paquin, and Rebecca Romaine Stamos, the studio finally felt that they were given the time to bring X-Men to the big screen. With a hyped-up marketing machine, X-Men would debut during the summer blockbuster season of 2000. X-Men earned $54 million in its opening weekend, a record for comic book films at the time. The film eventually grossed a worldwide total of $296 million, going well beyond the budget given. X-Men would be the 9th highest grossing film of 2000. The success of X-Men, alongside Blade, started a re-emergence of the comic book and superhero film genre. Marvel had finally realized their dream. After years of rejection and stiff competition, the company finally received the success that they had been longing for in Hollywood. The mutants were no longer shunned, but rather embraced by the world, and eventually resulted in a brand new X-Men animated series on the network television channel, the WB, titled X-Men Evolution. Thanks to the success of the live-action film, DC felt intimidation for the first time on all sides, as the new series was just as popular as Superman the Animated Series, and Bruce Timm's newest creation, Batman Beyond. Marvel had reached a crossroads thanks to their newfound success in film. With a larger budget and 2 highly anticipated sequels, the opportunity seemed endless. There was nothing wrong with giving the public another dose of the mutants, but if there was one thing that Marvel showed strength in, it was go big or go home. With that, Marvel felt it was the right time to give the movie-going public a chance to try something different while they waited for the mutants to return.